So, hi and welcome back to Frivolous Gravitas, part 2, where we're discussing with Megan and Jordan the developmental behaviors and genetics of gender differentiation and cell recombination, or not cell, gene recombination and cellular division. Obviously, this stuff is way over my head, but thankfully we have a guest speaker here who can help elucidate all these complicated details for us. So to start off, I wanted to quickly just sort of extend to you the limits of my knowledge on the subject. Is based on a book I read when I was like 19. So to date myself, that was like 15 years ago. So forgive my memory being a little foggy and probably my science being outdated, but this is the best I got, so deal with it. Essentially, the major thing I took away from that book was they had described that the eye actually develops differently between men and women, where the rods and cones are the cells that pick up photons. And the oversimplified version of this might be that women will tend to, probabilistically speaking, not definitively speaking, develop more color receptors in their eyes than the black and white receptors, which moderate or stimulate based on movement and action. And they sort of went on to extrapolate from that that's why boys are generally into cold colors like blues and blacks and reds and things that are active, like when they draw pictures as children, they'll draw rocket ships, whereas girls will draw like colorful expanse scenery, just because the way their brains are stimulated visually directly affects how their expression of gender is articulated behaviorally. I was wondering if maybe you had any comments or a way to something you can expand on that.
When you started, I was like, no, I've never heard that. But then as you continued talking, I realized that I actually did hear something, but like not from like class, but from like outside of class. So then of course I can't say how true it is, but I've just been like looking at a paper quickly. But yeah, it does look like there are some differences. And once you started talking about like, I definitely like only drew really colorful scenery when I was a kid. So that's something that kind of happened, and it would explain some of the woman knowing color really well, maybe. But like there are a lot of like roles for men and women that are like seem to be pretty well conserved in different cultures, like men doing the hunting in a hunting-gatherer society. Like that tends to be pretty well conserved across cultures in humans. And women like doing more of the gathering duties and like child rearing and that sort of thing. So having a difference in vision where women are more focused on gathering, which gathering you would want more color differentiation. It's actually one of the reasons why humans can have like such good differentiation of different colors of green. The reason that we have that is so we can tell plants apart, like which ones are poisonous and not poisonous.
And if they're ripe or not, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like how much sugar content they have.
Yeah, like are they ready to be picked and that sort of thing. And that's kind of more like following in the more gatherer side and like the more hunter side. But like even with that, it's like still a pretty subtle difference. So it's not like some like massive thing where men are just like red, blue. Like they still have pretty good color differentiation. Like if you were to like work in like paint or something, you would probably have better, like be really good at differentiating color, or like artists would probably still be better at it. Like a male artist would probably kick my butt at it because like that's what they work with all day. Whereas me, I just know that Zopiclone tablets are blue. That's all I need to know. So
not aqua or turquoise.
They are blue. Yeah, well, that's what people call them. As in pharmacy, you get to learn a lot of like, I'm taking a round like blue tablet, and you're like, oh yeah, I know what that is. So yeah. Yeah, like there are differences. There are some like brain sex differences as well. I
remember women have denser gray matter, I think, than men do, right?
There's something about amygdala activation and like emotional sensitivity or something. I can't remember exactly what the difference is. Honestly, when you start talking about like brain parts and like this part does this and these neurons do this, my eyes start to like get turned in circles a little bit. So I don't really want to talk on too much. Like I don't feel comfortable talking about too much like specifics of brain anatomy, but I have heard that there are some sex differences.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
It does extend into old age too. Like I think that's why men are more prone to heart disease, for instance, than women, and women tend to live longer, even though they live more stressful lives, generally speaking.
One of the things with heart disease is that estrogen is actually protective. So like women like if women do have heart attack, like basically what happens is the like rate of heart attacks in men starts like climbing a little more steadily, and women it's like suppressed for a while, and then after menopause hits it starts to climb at the same rate as men. So
But
it's
from
just,
a lower baseline though, right?
yeah, from a lower baseline, because estrogen is protective and you have lots of estrogen in your body from like being
Most of your life.
like menstruating, right? And then once you go through menopause, the amount of estrogen in your body is like significantly lower. The other thing, like there's hormone therapy as well, where you like take in estrogen and progesterone, which they use sometimes for menopausal symptoms, and that is also somewhat protective. But you have to like start it. If you start too late, it actually will cause heart attacks. So it will destabilize. So you have to like make sure you start it at the right time. But yeah, like it's definitely like estrogen is a factor in more heart attacks. I have also heard like some social related things, like sometimes men have like really stressful jobs, but like all of it's very much conjuncture. Like there's nothing with actual evidence in like the only thing that we like actually know for sure is different is like the estrogen levels.
So with that, it's kind of like saying that there are on the nurture side, there are environmental factors that also influence the growth of our organs, which influence our expression and behaviors, right?
Absolutely. Yep. So this like even can go back to like diet and exercise and that sort of thing. Like if you like work a really busy job and you end up eating like fast food for lunch every day or something, like it's going to have an effect on your body 100%. Like it's if of course it matters, and of course like what you're breathing in matters. Like places with more pollution have more asthma and like things like that. Like it, and like when you're in utero you're like even more sensitive to different things that your mom's taking or exposing herself to, and we don't really know a lot of the risks and they're hard to understand because again, you can't do experiments on pregnant women. You can't give a pregnant woman a drug and say like, did it harm your baby? Like that's not a thing that we can do. That's super messed up. So we end up doing it on observational research, which sometimes has issues. Even issues like women not wanting to say what they were doing during pregnancy, or maybe what they were doing before they knew they were pregnant or whatever. Like sometimes there's some like what we call the social desirability bias, but it's basically just trying to save face.
So with that in mind then, if someone were to go about trying to acclimatize an individual or a child to toward a certain gender from their own imposing of their own bias towards their child's like gender identity, not their actual male female gender, like when it's nebulous or uncertain.
Yeah.
Say that the nurturing they do to convince a microphallic boy to be a girl actually does physically impose some type of female responses in their systems that are developing still? Like, does it work to some degree?
There's like a difference between like using language and giving them only dolls to play with and doing that, and then like straight up giving them like estrogen injections from a young age, which again, I don't think we've ever done that. And I don't think we should.
No, but in keeping with the idea,
but like the thing is that like I did say that like that it's nature and nurture are not separate. They're together. But like some things are more related to one than the other. Like something like I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, like high cholesterol in families. Like if you have the gene for that, you're gonna have high cholesterol. There's nothing you can do about it. If you live like the healthiest life you possibly can, you eat the best possible low cholesterol diet, you're still gonna have high cholesterol. Like that's just 100%, that's nature. But most things aren't like that. Most genetic things are not like that. They've got a bit of both. And like I think what your gender, the point that we're even kind of dancing around here is that gender identity is like one of those things that still has a pretty large biological component. But the biological component isn't always 100% male or 100% female, right? But it, for the most part, it's you can't, and that's what they found in all these like kids that they were doing these like just raise them as a female. They were finding that like it didn't work. Like the kid would be like, yeah, I'm a man. Like I don't know why you did that. Now they like have to deal with the fact that they've been raised as a female, and that's like really fairly destructive to your psyche. So like, and I think one of the other issues too is that we're only like starting to see, because like you hear about a lot of kids that are being raised like completely gender neutral, and I don't think we really know yet what effects that has, because a lot of those kids are still kids, and we're not going to know until they're like 40 years old or more,
so
kind of what's really going on and how that's really going to affect them.
Part of me, like in a lot of these complex things, and this is might go for a bit of a trip here, but a lot of this is almost so complex that you have to look for places of ancient wisdom, I guess. I hate to say it like that, because wisdom is wisdom. It doesn't matter when it's from. But you get that idea of the Tao or the Zen, or in our society, go with the flow. And when you're trying to do something or be something that you're not, your life just kind of rebels against you. And I feel like a lot of this is happening for people, and whether or not, and they're not doing each other, and their parents aren't doing them any favors. So yes, maybe like in certain circumstances, you may not know which is the Zen that your child should, or the path that your child should follow, but you can, that's why you do that, delayed treatment and, wait and see kind of stuff, make the best guess. But at the same time, if you are forcing someone to go against it, you're creating problems for them. Like, you get that cognitive dissonance is, oh, I'm being told this, but it doesn't feel like it's right. So, or you just end up going with the flow anyways, because it's just like, this is what I'm going to do. You get a forceful child who's just been like, yeah, but I don't care, so I'm going to go play with my trucks.
And I think the other problem is too, is you never know what's going to work until the child grows up. Like, it might actually work really well on one kid, like just being said, just like forcing them into one role, because maybe they'll be like, yep, that's correct, or maybe they'll be like, yep, you forced me into that and it was definitely wrong, so now I'm switching and I'm happy. Like,
well,
we can't
like,
predict
what happens if you say, oh, well, I'm being told I'm born a boy, I'm being told I'm gender fluid, or gender is stupid, so like I'm being raised as a boy and a girl, or neither. And so the kid's miserable, and then they're like, well, why am I miserable? And it's like, because of the external forces that are upon you. The world doesn't understand you. There's all these externalized things.
There's like infinite parenting styles, and some of them work better with some kids. Like, some kids need structure. I needed structure. I still need structure. If I don't have structure, I just like sit and stare off into a wall, and I'm like, my brain melts out my ears. Like, I need something planned to do, otherwise I don't do anything. And like, so if I was raised by like a really laissez-faire kind of parenting method, I wouldn't be very successful.
Yeah,
so but then it's the same thing.
Good. There's laissez-faire.
Yeah, I know, but like, we're getting
like where they
a little
say,
off topic, but
do it. And then there's laissez-faire, which is like, I'm just going to let them be free and do whatever they want.
I'm talking like romantic levels, like capital
Emile
R romantic.
Rousseau,
yeah, like Rousseau. That's what I'm talking about. Like, if I was raised like that, I would be completely useless. Like,
see,
I
for
needed
me, that
the
would have
structure.
been totally easy, because like my parents' parenting style was, they tried to be strict, but when I rebelled, it just made everybody's life miserable. And when they left me be alone, I was just insanely productive. So like, I think you bang on there about it being parenting for the child. Just, it's totally relative to who that person is.
And I think even pushing like gender norms and stereotypes in is still something that's like, it's still going to fall under that. Like, some kids just won't care. They'll be like, nope, I want to hit things with my sword, and I want to draw rockets, and I want to like play with cars, and these dolls are silly, and I don't want dresses. Go away. Like, some kids are going to be like that.
What's the point in dressing something up just to undress it and dress it up again? Like, I have no idea how
fun, Chris.
Do that for fun. I just want to break everything I touch to see what's inside.
See, I was always an explorer. I would always be like, what's over there? What's over there? I'm going to climb up to that thing. I'm going to see this. And like, someone restraining me would have gotten ire. Yes.
That hasn't
And
changed.
Decaf alto shack.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was always off into the sunset. And it's like, no, you're grounded. And I was like, okay, let's see how long that lasts.
Mhm. Yeah, so did you
But
guys want me to do like a quick little like go over
Oh,
of
yeah,
some of the
please.
biology I talked in the first half? Yeah. Yeah, so I'm gonna start even small. Last time I started with DNA, I'm gonna start even smaller this time.
Start at
So-
quarks.
Start at quarks. No, I'm not gonna do that. Charm quarks are my favorite.
Strange
for-
quarks are my favorite.
Yeah, they would be. No, I'll just start at atoms. Just this. Okay, the word means that you can't divide it, because like the idea is that if you have like a piece of cheese, you could cut it in half and you could cut it in half again, and eventually you wouldn't be able to cut it in half anymore. But if you don't think you can cut an atom in half, look up the Manhattan Project. So anyway, atoms form molecules together, and molecules can form more complex things, but it takes work to make them be complex, and energy. Work is energy. And DNA is a molecule. It is a very, very big molecule, and it has repeating subunits. There's 4 different types, A, T, C, G. And basically the order of them specifies a blueprint, and the blueprint is telling you when to make proteins, how to make proteins, and like the code for the protein, and like has like sequences to regulate when it's made.
Oh, slow down, hold on. Sorry. Those ACTGs, those are amino acids, right?
No, they are nucleotides.
They're nucleotides. What's
So
the
they're
difference
made up
between
of-
an amino acid and a nucleotide?
So a nucleotide is made up of a sugar, which is in DNA, it's deoxyribose. It's a 5-ring sugar. There's a phosphate group on it, which is phosphorus with oxygens around it. And then there is the like actual nucleoside, it's called. Oh, I think I'm mixing it up. And that's the A, T, C, and G. And they're just 4 different molecules. 2 of them are 1-ring, 2 of them are 2-ringed. And basically they form complementary bonds so that your DNA has like, it runs like in opposite anti-parallel directions, but they like have like A's always bind with T's and C's always bind with G's. So if
it's quaternary, right? It's not actually a 4 to the power of 4. It's like a 2 to the power of 2.
No, not really, because like having a T on the other side, it's going to be like also a T, but they're running opposite, but it's the same. Like one of the sides is going to actually be the code for the protein, and the other one's going to be like just the thing that's complementary to the protein. But the reason it's like that is so you can like rip it apart and then use it to duplicate and make 2 of them.
I gotcha.
So that's because you need to be able to replicate it, otherwise it doesn't work.
So
DNA,
how many possible combinations are there of the 4 nucleotides?
Well, you have like, it's just like you have like A, T, C, G just in whatever order, and then you can just kind of ignore the other side because it's just complementary in there to like.
So it could be
just be there for replicating.
ACTG.
Oh no, they can be like any order of
no
them. It can be like
restrictions
A, T, T,
Oh, okay.
A, T, like anything. There's just 4 types.
I gotcha.
So, and it can be in any order, and there's like long regions that are just repeats. And yeah, so that's why it gets very complicated very quickly, because it can hold a lot more data than like binary, because you have 4 choices rather than on or off, right?
Yeah, that's sort of what I was asking about with the powers, like how
there's 4 choices, not 2. So you can hold more data in smaller areas.
So it is 4 to the power of 4, right? That's the number of combinations in one segment of DNA?
I suppose.
Like all of them can be recombined with each other in their own.
Well, they can all like, because if the other half is just like it's just the opposite, and it's just there to replicate.
Yeah.
It can be like any order of the 4.
So AAAA.
Yeah.
CCCC, AACC, AAAC, like that. It
can be
going,
anything,
right?
and it goes on for like millions and millions of base pairs.
I think that's 4 to the power of 4 then. I'm gonna look that up though.
256
I'm not sure.
times a billion.
There's lots. It's complicated. But basically your DNA like tells you how to make the proteins. It's got like a specific code Like, and they're like groups of 3. So like, oh great, there's like a silly thing where RNA has U's instead of T's. It's not really that important, but if you have like UAA, that's a stop codon. I haven't memorized any other ones, so, but if you have like CGG, that means like tryptophan or something. I don't actually know what it means. I just made that up. That's probably wrong. But each like group of 3 specifies one specific amino acid. So like it directly tells you how to make the protein. And the proteins do all the stuff in your cells. So they like can do the reactions, catalyze the reactions like we talked about with the CAH. So it can like catalyze the reactions to make your steroid hormones. It can just form the structure. So that's just like your, like basically your cells have 2 like microtubules, which are just like form structure. They're like a little skeleton for it. They can transport, bring stuff around in the cell. They can be involved in signaling and hormones.
Is there periodicity to all of this too? Like the repetition and the frequency of repetition that affects how the gene is expressed? Or is it strictly just code and then?
So there is like a whole system of epigenetics, which just means above genetics, and it's involved in gene regulation. So you actually have tags on the genes that either tell it to like not to condense and make less or like expand, or because like your DNA, when it's gathered, it's not normally sitting in a chromosome. It's usually all unwound, bunch of spaghetti, just like everywhere. It is actually not everywhere. It's very specifically placed, but that gets more complicated. But when it's dividing, it like forms like a big, like a chromosome, so it doesn't like break apart randomly. So there's like codes that make it more condensed so that the gene can't be expressed. And that's what your like epigenetics is that's like that regulation. So it involves modifications to the DNA itself, but also the proteins that DNA binds to like keep it stable. But that is like a whole complex other thing, because that's affected by like your environment. That's affected by like, there's like sex differences. There are like lots of different little things. Like you have like some genes that you only express the one you got from your mom, not the one you got from your dad. There's differences in DNA methylation and things like autism. And yeah, it gets very complicated very quickly.
Like demyelination too, like with
demyelination
MS,
is like a whole like order of magnitude above this. It's like your neurons have like these myelin sheaths that
the entire thing.
It's the sheathing around like the whole like long part of the neuron. Okay. And basically in MS, your body attacks it. So most of the MS drugs are focused on like turning down that part of your immune system or like preventing your immune system from getting into your brain. And they're all incredibly expensive. All of those drugs. Yeah. So
and does this process also apply to mitochondrial DNA equally, or is that so
because it's like bacterial, it's technically bacterial DNA. I guess so the story with your mitochondria is that back like billions of years ago, a bacteria ate another bacteria. This probably happened several times and was like, and the other bacteria started making energy for it, but staying alive. And they were like, hey, this relationship is working great. So that kept going. And that's kind of what makes up all the, what we call eukaryotic cells now, which is all of your cells. Basically everything that's not bacteria or the other type of weird bacteria that are weird. They're archaea. They just are weird bacteria that live in like deep sea vents and stuff. And they all have. Is
the sperm then transferring that type of DNA too, like within?
So that's a good question, actually, because generally all your mitochondrial DNA comes from your mom. Every once in a while, you can get a little bit of your dad's in there, but for the most part, it comes from your mom. So there are some mitochondrial diseases where like your mitochondria have like something wrong with them. And what that means is it affects your ability to make energy. So most of the time, these are like diseases with like your muscles aren't working. There's like some sort of fatigue. There's some sort of like energy issue with those diseases, and they're maternally inherited.
What happens if you have two dads?
Then you have to go to your biological mom. Or we invented some new cool science that I'm really excited about. There is like science about like, can we try to make a child out of like two eggs by like combining their DNA? there's a lot of kinks in it, but there is some really interesting science about that.
I imagine that would be a little kinky, yeah.
I know Jordan's trying to make a joke out of it, and I just turned it into science, but that's what I do.
Well, I kind
Bravo,
of
that takes
it
practice.
was intentional because like we're talking about this stuff and claiming that two men can create a baby just as well as like a woman and a man or a woman and a woman is ludicrous. And like I'm saying it as a joke, but what you're saying is like as you're saying this, me saying that is absolutely ridiculous.
Like it's not impossible for it to occur. It's going to be very difficult, and I don't foresee it occurring for like many years. But it's not impossible that we could like get DNA from 2 sperms and then basically put them in an egg. And maybe we could like incubate the egg ourselves. Maybe we have to like stick it in a woman that will carry it. But like it's not impossible.
Yeah, but it would be an artificial process, one that won't happen naturally without human intervention and technology. And that no amount of redefinition of technology would, or no redefinition of how we view the world, or creating better realities based on pronoun use or something would change that.
Yeah, I mean, like at the same time, you could get like a person that was born female that identifies as a male, like have a baby with someone who was born male identified with a male. Like that's technically that, but like at the same time, like it's not 2 biological males. Like there is still like somewhat of a distinction. But
okay, so going back to your scaling out, we've got
so I was just talking about like the DNA has a code for proteins, also when to make the proteins and how much of the protein to make. And then your proteins do everything. Remember, I talked about how your DNA can't leave your nucleus, so you have to have a messenger like be copied, and then it also gets spliced, which I didn't talk about before. So your DNA is like just absolutely filled to the brim with random sequences, some of which we know are for regulation, some of which we know are just like artifacts, some of which we're just like, I don't know what this is doing here. So
and some are maybe filler, because like a response might be to the size of a gene, so they just need to fill up that gene.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's also just like bits of DNA that are just like basically jumping. They're just genes that just like want to fill up your DNA, so they just like jump around and just keep filling it up, which it happens. They're weird stuff. But so you have to splice out all the bits that you don't want, and sometimes if you like have mutations that like changes the splicing, that you can also have like that can also lead to genetic disease. Spinal muscular atrophies like that, but that one's really complicated, so I won't talk about it too much.
I think spina bifida is like that, isn't it?
I don't
where it's like the whole gene is sheared off to one side, so everything's just misaligned. I could be wrong on
that. There's like a few that are related to splicing, but like I can't like say them all off the top of my head. And like a lot of diseases that are just like it's a mutation in this gene, it's actually like a splicing problem.
Oh yeah.
So anyway, but you once that process happens, the mRNA gets processed so it doesn't look like viral mRNA, and then that goes out into the rest of the cell, and the cell has ribosomes which translate it and then make a protein based on the code. And then part of the code of the protein also is things like involves some of the processing, because some proteins aren't just ready to go as soon as the amino acid chain is filled up. Like some need like some sugars tacked on, some need like some lipids tacked on, some need to be like changed so they fold properly. So there's sometimes some other processing.
Is there some part of the cell that's like checking on everything? Like
it goes through overseer? Like your like you have like a Golgi apparatus which like works on packaging and like moving stuff around. And like honestly, the more I look into protein processing, the more confused I get. It's one of those like things that gets a little nuts. But you do have codes for it to go like, because like some proteins are made to like sit on a membrane, so they have to be made on a membrane, otherwise they'll fold wrong and be messed up. So they are actually created such that they are like created inside a membrane inside your cell, and then from there are transported to where they need to go, whether if that's like out, like on the outer membrane of the cell or whatever.
So that membrane would also be defined by the genetic code that it's writing, right?
Sort of, yeah. It's because like You
Like,
kind of
where's the protocol or the instruction set for the operations for the genetic recombiners?
the thing is that the cells are weird because there's nobody in charge. There isn't anything in charge. There isn't like a cell guy being like, "Okay, do this now, do this now." It's just a bunch of code that
there's
like
no priority
it's
queue or
very
nothing?
janky. It's some very janky code. No, there is not like priority. You can have like way more copies of one mRNA type than the other, so more will get made at once, but it's not like it gets to like boot itself in line because like things are just moving around randomly, right?
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's just like the jankiest algorithm you can imagine, and that's a cell.
From order and structure and reducibility, we come down to chaos and complexity once again from the
Yes,
finest
pretty
levels.
much. You go through like you go from like I have no idea, it's utter chaos, to like, oh, it's structured, and then you go down further and you're like, wait, what?
Exactly. That fascinates me about nature, as it seems to
Yeah,
always
it's
work that
really,
way.
really cool. You just have all these molecules and they're just like, why does this work? But it just works. That's all I got for you. So I talked about like chromosomes as well. We have 23 pairs, so 46 altogether.
Do you want to maybe mention how, like, CRISPR and what it is and how it works and what
Okay.
people are doing
I can
with it?
talk a little bit about CRISPR. So when I was like doing my genetics degree, this was like super hype and new. Everyone was really excited about it. It's still pretty hype though, but basically the CRISPR-Cas9 system is a bacterial system that was used to try to remember viral DNA, so that if that bacteria ran into that viral DNA again, it would know it was bad and chop it up. So that was the thing. So what the system would do is it would be like, see DNA that's not itself, that's wrong, it's viral DNA, and it would take a chunk of it and then incorporate it into its own cell, into its own genome. So now the genome is just like has chunks of viral DNA. It can't like express or anything. It's not a full gene. It's just like a random chunk of their DNA. But because DNA is like there's 4 of them, and even if you get like a short sequence, it's still pretty unique to that virus, right? So then what would happen is there would be proteins that would wander around with those sequences in them. And then if they found the complementary sequence, which would be the virus, it'd be like, oh, heck no, I got to cut this guy up. So then it would just cut it. So we learned how to hijack it so we can put whatever sequence we want into the protein, the Cas9 protein. And then when it runs into that specific sequence, it just chops it up. And
Word for word, it's just sort of like following one for the other, right?
It's looking for an exact sequence. So you can put something in there, like say you have a cancer and you have what's called an oncogene in it. So what an oncogene does is basically it promotes cell growth, but in a way that's like unregulated and damaging to the system around it. So say you have an oncogene, you can like find the exact mutation you have, stick it in there, and then the protein, if it can get into your cell, which is another huge problem, if it can get into there and find that gene, it'll just chop it up. And then that gene in that cell will not exist anymore. So that's one thing. It also could be used for like, it's just being looked at for like genetic diseases, like more rare genetic diseases. So to like, if you've got like some sort of defective gene that's like causing blindness or something, they might be able to like inject it somehow or get it into your system somehow. That
Like, as a post-mortem treatment or preventative, like before the fetus is
would
even
be, I think, you know what? I can't really imagine that they would do it before birth, because if you try to stick a needle into like any of the sacs, there's a chance that it can cause spontaneous abortion. So even like getting amnio to like test the baby's DNA has a like 1 in 200 risk of causing an abortion. So I feel like it'd probably be something that would happen after birth. If the kid's smaller, then there's less cells to change, so maybe that would be better.
But there's more stem
but
cells still.
but then the other problem is your system doesn't work the same way. So, and all things, it needs to be tested in a certain population, and then if they test it in only 6-year-olds, then you can only use it in 6-year-olds. Like you kind of they wouldn't do that, but that's just an example.
It sounds like the implementation of it, though, like over time, if we think about like we've only had this type of sciences for like a few decades, relatively speaking, it's a drop in the bucket. If humans persist for like another 200,000 years, we'll have enough of these small little samples to do something with it. like
Well,
ethically?
it's not like finding the samples of what to correct. That's not the problem. It's like making something that works. That's the problem. Like, we've done gene therapy before. There's like a really famous case of a gentleman in the 90s who had I can't remember the genetic disease, but they were using adenovirus to deliver a gene vector, and it was like helping with his disease process, but he ended up having like a very severe immune reaction and ended up passing away from it. So it kind of scared everyone off of gene therapy. So but like we've been getting a lot better, and even like the coronavirus vaccine that's coming out now, I don't know when this video is going to be uploaded, but like the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines have been approved here. So they're both mRNA vaccines. And so it's kind of like gene therapy a little bit, but it's basically just because we talked about mRNA, messenger RNA. So they make it look like normal human messenger RNA. So it has the cap on it and the sequences of A's at the end and all that stuff. And it was, as soon as the coronavirus was sequenced like a year ago, we could make that virus, but it was about making a vector that, like, I think they made the vector pretty quickly as well, which is it's been a lipid ball essentially. And it's like that because if you didn't
move it around, right?
well, if you didn't put it in the lipid ball, then you would inject it and your body would just immediately destroy the mRNA and it would be useless. So you need it to be delivered into the cells. So that's why it's in there. And then the thing that took so long was making it work, getting evidence that it works and getting evidence that it's not going to like cause anaphylaxis immediately and kill everyone that uses it or give them all coronavirus. Like, well, we knew it wouldn't be that because it's a spike protein. Like, it's basically all it's doing is say like, hey, if a guy in like a purple t-shirt walks in, he's a bad guy. So that's kind of what the vaccine does, is you're looking for the purple t-shirt guy, which is coronavirus. Don't know why you would wear a purple t-shirt.
Molecular profiling.
It is molecular profiling.
That's discrimination there, Megan.
Yeah, you should be ashamed.
Yeah, I am so
also
ashamed.
For mentioning the that virus. Even if we do end up being able to monetize, we won't be able to now.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's good. We don't want to be monetized because
okay.
we'd be beholden to our sponsors and the algorithm.
Gross.
It's better to be unknown.
Okay, COVID-19.
China, war, genocide, COVID. Now we're covered.
Concentration camps with Muslims. What?
Yeah, Falun Gong.
So if I could ask
Tiananmen
you then,
Square.
Yes,
there it is.
Tiananmen. That'll get us banned, at least
there
from
it
China.
Is. Okay, what were you saying,
with
Chris?
respect to gene editing, then moving away from CRISPR, where we can chop, delete, or insert different genetic code. What about drugs that affect us? DMARDs, I think they're called. Disease modifying.
Yeah, those are like that. We're just like, I've only heard it like specifically related to rheumatoid arthritis. And all that means is that it's making it so that disease doesn't progress. Because like rheumatoid arthritis.
Probably the wrong word then. I was like, anyway, sorry.
Yeah. But anyway, they just prevent, because like if you think of like the traditional like really terrible arthritis where like it looks incredibly painful and all your fingers are like leaning towards the outside and like it's very awful. We have drugs now that can prevent that, or at least make it happen very, very, very slowly.
What about drugs that affect genetic code?
Yeah, so there are like a couple, like they're all like $1 million right now, and most of them aren't like permanently affecting genetic code.
Are those like AIDS and HIV drugs? Like what kind of class?
Okay, so those ones are like they're like interacting with DNA, but they're not necessarily like modifying your DNA. They're just like preventing the vaccine from replicating. So like the antivirals have like lots of different targets. They target several different viral proteins, and they just prevent it from replicating.
In what way? Do you know? Like the mechanism of action?
You know what? Maybe if you asked me a few years ago, I haven't like actually formally gone over it yet, but it's.
Oh, no worries.
I know that they do affect some of them affect the reverse transcriptase, which is it basically turns RNA into DNA, which before we discovered this, we didn't know that that could happen. We thought that you could only go DNA to RNA, and then RNA gets translated into protein, and then we found this reverse transcriptase, and it blew everybody's minds, and all the scientists were like, oh no, this couldn't possibly be what actually happens, because sometimes scientists get too stuck in their ways, which is sometimes good because you should be skeptical, but also sometimes you show them evidence and they're like, nope, the way I learned was right. So, they're people.
Would that count as a transcription factor then?
No,
If it's a
because
drug
it's
that's
actually
capable of changing DNA?
no. If transcription factors have to change the way that it's being expressed as proteins. And the other problem is like it's really hard to get proteins, like protein drugs, to have like into cells. It's not always easy.
Why is that?
Cell membranes. So some proteins don't just like cross into cells. They have to be like transported in.
Is that like the role of enzymes and stuff, or like
It's
how do
membrane transport? Like some of the small proteins can just jump in, but some just get stuck on the outside.
how generally does that work though? Like,
well, it's like the like you have to put the mRNA in a lipid particle. Like sometimes you'd have to put it in a lipid particle to get it in. But like different proteins are different, and like drugs too. Like usually drugs are small molecules, which is why they can go into cell membranes, but like they have to it depends on like their solubility in water and oil as well. Like there's a lot of factors into getting drugs into where they need to go. That's like a huge part of drug development.
are you familiar with any of the nanotechnologies that work on like transport nanotech to?
Yeah, there are some out there. There's a couple cancer drugs actually that are being used now, and they're basically targeted to, because they put like really toxic like extra like chemo drugs, which are, if you give them through your whole body, then you get a lot of, you're like losing hair, you're getting mouth ulcers and like hand and foot syndrome and all these terrible things that can happen. Yeah. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to make it so it only you can deliver the cytotoxic drugs directly to the cancer cells, and it like kind of works. It's not like as spectacular as people were hoping, but it definitely like helps with some of the side effects. But then you get some different side effects sometimes. So it's you get like this hand and foot syndrome that can be caused where you get like it gets like bright red on your like palms of your hands, soles of your feet, and it can like start peeling and get inflamed and get like really, really bad from like the lipid. It's basically the lipid particles go to the wrong spot, basically. So
does that affect at all like the concentrations of, say, like microplastics or metals or anything like that are being transported through our lymph system or circulatory system? Does that affect how genes
can't really speak to that very much. Haven't really like done research on it. I expect that some things, but like again, actually affecting like the process of getting genes and like changing transcription and that sort of thing is probably not the main mechanism it has for like causing damage. Like metals might lead to oxidation, oxidative damage, puts extra stress on the cells, and then that can be what causes them to like die. So it's probably not related to like the actual genetics part of it, but like other damages that.
But like conditions like Alzheimer's, then they're pretty genetic related, right?
There are, yeah. So that one, it has like relationships to like there's internal parts, and then there's like this big, huge protein that it's on the outside of like neurons all the time, and it's sometimes like a receptacle for holding amino acids, because some stuff doesn't get into your brain very well, so it's kind of a receptacle for it, and usually it just gets chopped up as you need it. But in Alzheimer's, it gets chopped up in the wrong spot, and then it's not soluble anymore, so it clumps together and forms these beta amyloid plaques, which is very distinctive.
And that's what the drugs sort of tend to, is
the drugs for Alzheimer's don't really work that well. They change some cell signaling. They kind of help stabilize you for a little while if you have moderate disease, but then eventually they stop working. So there's only like 3 that are used here for Alzheimer's, and they're like, they can make a difference, but like not a huge one. big enough difference to be sold and approved for prevention, for like helping with symptoms, but not a huge difference really.
I gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
And what about the role of enzymes in development and like cellular reproduction and splitting and things like that? Is there something you might be able to tell us about how different enzymes encourage, or hormones encourage cell growth, or
So,
like genetic division?
Well,
Or
cell growth is like, most of what we know from cell growth is from cancer. Because the best way to study something in development in biology is to study when it goes wrong and see what went wrong, and then you know that that's the thing that's wrong is what usually makes it go right. That's like the main technique of developmental biology. So many like chickens and frogs have been like made to have like one gene be wrong to see how it develops. But yeah, there's like a lot of processes involved in, there's a few processes involved in cell division and cell growth, and you get like hormones from like all circulating throughout your body, but then it's a little bit different for different cell types. Like prostate cancers are almost entirely fueled by testosterone. So and like breast cancers can be fueled by like estrogen, progesterone. Some cancers are like, you have like human growth hormones, which are like normal for them to be floating around, but then they have like super sensitive receptors that if they catch one of them, then they just like completely go into dividing mode. Then there's like
cortisol can affect all that too, right? Like if you've got high levels of cortisol from like anxiety, stress, or chronic pain or something, that can change the way
it can affect a lot of things. It's cortisol deals a lot with inflammation too. So that's why like a lot of chronic inflammatory diseases are related to stress levels as well, and are more likely to flare when you are like going through stressful situations. Because like it's everything is related, and that's like another point that kind of is clear in medical science, is that if you have two diseases, they're related to each other. It doesn't matter if it's like they don't seem like they're related at all. They are, because they're both occurring in the same individual. So everything's related, and you always have to treat them as a person with like several things.
As a person with chronic health conditions, I can absolutely attest to that veracity.
Yes, you can't, like if someone's got one disease and someone's got four, you cannot treat them the same at all.
But I mean, it's useful information to compare the two, but they're not absolutely identical. And a lot of the times I think we overlook the fact that a useful probability of correlation does not equate to exact.
It can be an issue sometimes because medicine like gets specialized, and you get like specialists writing guidelines and being like, if they have diabetes, you need to do this, this, and this. It's like, well, what if they also have like MS and like schizophrenia and just like
diabetes and colitis
and colitis and like all these like things? Like you can't just like, there are things that you like, it gets complicated, and then you get specialists having fights at guideline discussions, and that sounds kind of funny. But
the other big problem I found with it is they don't communicate with each other. So they don't talk about the gray overlaps in their Venn diagrams. They just accept the fact that there's another specialist dealing with that other issue. They accept the fact that they're interrelated, but they refuse to work together. That's
why it's good to have a common pharmacist.
Yeah, that's what the pharmacists basically do now. And I think that's putting a lot of weight on them. Like they shouldn't be our first line of defense. But is there a way you think doctors could communicate better between specialists and physicians? Or
they learn how to communicate? No.
That would be
I actually think that one of the...
Well, they could learn how to write first. Legible writing would be helpful.
Yes. One of the... Actually, there's like some point about going towards this of like having medical like information be like more so that everyone can see it, rather than like each doctor having their own file on somebody and then never talking to each other. And there's also like a movement towards having like interdisciplinary teams working on people.
That's a good idea.
And like we're being taught a lot about like communicating as much as we can, and like maybe they're on an anticoagulant and they have an anticoagulant team, but now they have like something else going on, so now, or they're like they get colitis and now they're bleeding, so maybe they shouldn't be anticoagulated, but what about the heart valve they just got? So like it becomes complicated. And I think there's definitely a movement in medicine to be like communicating more, but it's moving slowly.
I think that's where the Chinese and like tyrannical governments basically have the advantage over democracies, because they're able to implement these broad sweeping changes to the system and carry everyone's individual data at the cost of privacy and, you know, ethics and whatnot.
And the cost of
Happiness.
ethics and
Well,
happiness.
it is truly at the cost of ethics, but like the government in China has the tools to do things that we have to just sit and say, oh, well, we can't do it. So
Yeah, but
somebody's going to learn it before
The thing
us,
is
right?
that in our society, if we screw up, we can go and start again. When you move an entire society in one direction and they screw up, the chances that it's going to affect the entire society poorly is more likely. Like if it's one company within a country trying something, yes, it might happen slower, but that company dies instead of the country dying when, you know, that company fails. So rather than part of the country failing. So in the more resources you put into it, the more that society is dependent on that one thing succeeding. And it's based on false premises, like, say, certain German processes in the early 20th century, then when those fail, they have to keep going down that faulty path, and you end up with, you know, a bad end. So I understand that if we all just, you know, force people to go in one direction, that, you know, we can get stuff done faster. But if we're wrong, then everyone's gonna hurt instead of just, you know, one corporation. So
That's actually my major trepidation with the rollout of this antivirus, the COVID vaccine. It's not so much that I think it's harmful, but even a fraction of 1% of the world's population, if our goal is to inoculate the entire world, that's a lot of people. And to not have
Well, and,
long-term data while you're injecting a
it's
bunch
a
of
little bit scary, yeah. But like even
well,
there
the
was
thing I bring
a
it to is like the Zika virus, right? We didn't know that the Zika virus was causing microcephaly until after babies were born. That's a thing
Yeah.
you can't possibly know for 9 months. And then even then it took us a few months to figure out the connection.
Well,
right?
even like think of how many people had like thalidomide. I knew I wasn't going to get through this podcast without bringing up thalidomide. You just can't work in pharmacy and not bring up thalidomide. So for those of you that don't know, thalidomide was a drug used in the 50s and 60s to help with morning sickness for pregnant women. However, it caused like some pretty severe birth deformities, like limb deformities mostly, along with other health problems. And it was a big sign of like, oops, we screwed up. It was actually like in the manufacturing process, there's like 2 mirror images of the drug, and one of them was bad and one of them was okay. Basically, one of the issues is that your body recognizes mirror images of molecules as being different, whereas there's no way to, it's like almost impossible to distinguish it if you're just doing tests in a lab, and they behave differently as chemicals in a lab when you're just like mixing stuff together.
That's the chirality you're speaking of,
yeah,
right?
that's
Like
exactly what I'm talking about.
right-handedness?
Yeah, like left-handed, right-handed, sort of. And yeah, when they were manufacturing the drug, they just like manufactured it such that they had the like RNS enantiomers, which is like the 2 different sides. And yeah, one of them caused severe birth deformities, and they were giving this to pregnant women for like more than 10 years. So
Yikes.
there's a lot of people affected by it. So nowadays, thalidomide is actually still used. It's used in multiple myeloma. I think there's a few other indications for it, but that's the main one I know about. And in order to get it, you have to like sign up with this program. The pharmacist that's dispensing it has to sign up. The doctor has to sign up. And if you're female, you have to go for like pregnancy tests like constantly. You have to be on 2 forms of birth control, and it's just like completely wild.
Yikes.
There's tons of like bureaucratic work now if you want to have this drug, which is helpful in a couple of conditions. But like if you're like a man, you like can't even like, you have to like not have, you're like, and you're like with a woman, she has to be on birth control while you're using it. Like it's very.
And all this that we're talking
Tense.
about, is it restricted just to animal genes, or do these genes expressed in plants sort of follow the same mechanisms?
Yeah, this is like what I'm talking about is like what I talked about with eukaryotes. So it's basically everything but bacteria, which is a little bit different. It's kind of the same process, but like they don't have a nucleus, so it's all like happening closer together. but it's the same thing where you've got DNA and then it has to be translated or transcribed into mRNA, and then the mRNA has to be translated into proteins. That process is exactly the same in every living thing, unless you consider viruses living.
Not so much.
Okay, good. We don't have to have that talk.
No, they don't have wants, needs, or poop, so they're not real to me.
Well, do bacteria have wants or needs?
Yeah, they want more food and they want to poop and they want to split.
Fair enough. That's all anyone really wants.
I
That's
get
all
that
everyone
on
really
a deep
wants.
level. I really get that.
It really speaks to me.
Yeah.
Well, it sort of differentiates static objects from animate objects, I think.
Yeah,
Is
there's like a
The
like
impetus, there's a volition to them. to
there's
want
like a
to.
old thing I learned about in like my first biology classes of like 7 things you have to be considered alive. Like bacteria have like 4 of them or something. I don't remember.
But the funny thing is,
long
of the
ago.
list, living things can be classified without all of those things. So we've made like some exceptions for like the extremophiles and for
Yeah, like because
types
they're super interesting.
fungi especially. They can spread across like the entire Amazonian forest, but they
Yeah,
don't have
they're-
a brain or they don't
They are
defecate.
super cool. Well, because they eat the poop.
yeah, it's just neat.
Yeah, life
What's
gets
that
pretty
called?
wacky.
Myco something? The study
yeah.
of mushrooms?
Myco just means
Jordan knows that one.
Yeah, there's you get just like the weird bacteria too. There's this one that lives in like salty water that's like almost 2-dimensional. And it's like that because it lives in like super salty water. And
So it squeezes
one of my
between salts.
one of my not really. One of my profs was like super excited about it, but he was like, but I can't get funding because I give all the funding to like people studying medical stuff and viruses that infect people. He was really salty about it. Salty.
So,
I understand that we've completely taken this topic in a completely different direction, so maybe we should not make this part 2.
Hey,
And
we
just
don't have a
make this-
title. It's not fair to like say we're off topic if we don't have a title.
well, I kind of want to venture back to the main path, which was
Okay, fine.
you guys kind of went back there, which I thought was really gracious of you, which was development of mammalian forms, specifically with regard to the sex development. But I think that was actually very useful because you definitely went through, like, I don't think this is a place to go for the minutia of this and that, but it's definitely a good representation of the complexity again involved in this and how things just sometimes don't work. But and that, well, I mean, what do you guys think that we can take from this, having heard everything we've heard in the last many hours?
So
Or I'll go if you don't have anything.
go ahead, Chris.
I think the biggest thing that we can take from, or that I hope that the audience takes from this, is the fact that just because things are complex doesn't mean they're not reducible and reachable to everybody. I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of everything that Megan studied, but the fact that we can sit here and have a conversation that's coherent is sort of evidence of the fact that it's accessible to anybody who seeks it. And I think the important thing to note is knowing that something is accessibly knowable is important, because then it's not putting it into a black box and just trusting somebody else to look after it for you. I think ethics are a conversation in not just genetics, but all of medical science, including pharmaceuticals. Ethics is a conversation the entire population should be engaged in, because it shouldn't be just the scientists deciding what to do. They're supposed to be representing the nation's interests in their work. And I think making accessible what would formerly be inaccessible is making huge strides in helping us not just understand what we're doing, but also participate in the in its evolution or progress.
So, and I think a
Kudos,
lot
Megan.
building on that is that this, just because it's a slow process doesn't mean it needs to be a fast process. And in fact, speeding up the process would cause us to not just do things unethically, but miss the point of some of these things in themselves, because sometimes you need to see the long-term effects. Since that to know the long-term effects, you have to wait those long terms. So science is a long process, and we can't speed it up just because one individual is suffering more, because that's not, we need to come to proper conclusions, and pretending that you know the conclusions just because you're suffering is ludicrously foolish, because we are looking for the right thing, the thing that works, the thing that can be tested positively, not the thing that conforms to our feeling.
I think the if you're you can
no
finish.
Go ahead.
I think the other thing that we were kind of going on is that we shouldn't be making like sweeping labels and generalizations about how things are working, and we should be trying to let people decide for themselves. And like we talked about that with like treating these disorders of sex development, that like what we're moving towards now is like fixing any immediate problems and then letting the person, the individual who is born with this, decide what they want from their life, but like involving their parents and talking to them and explaining it, and like making people do that instead of just labeling people, throwing them in and saying you're this, so do this.
Right, but if we're letting them decide, then a 12-year-old who's taken one class with the they've been subjected to the gender galaxy, thinks like, oh, I'm actually I'm actually a girl, when they're just about to go through puberty and everything's about to it's just normal puberty
and
BS.
Like I don't know what I don't know what exactly if they have to like talk to a psychologist before they decide to get surgery, or they would just put them on blockers till they're a little older.
Yeah,
I do know a little bit
first.
I do know a little bit about like trans like teenagers and younger children that come out as trans and say that they're trans. They do have to see a psychiatrist, of which there are very few in this country. And it takes a long time. So it takes a long time to get in. They have to get like the gender dysphoria diagnosis from one of these psychiatrists. And you can't, and then at that point, and until you see them, you can't get any sort of like blockers or anything. You have to like just basically deal with it until you can get that. And then there's like another big process to go through if you wanted to get surgery. But generally they don't do the surgery until after you're 18. And so it's like quite a lengthy process, but if you were born intersex, I don't know if you can like skip any of those hurdles or how that works. Like I can't speak.
Well, the other thing is that during that process of the workflow of making sure that this is something that you are, if you get a overly critical diagnosis from the psychologist or the doctor, and then you just go to another one and get an answer that you want, like or the doctors in the workflow, I think one guy I was reading was showing how guided or leading the questions were in Britain towards this, and how you could just, all you had to do is answer the right questions and get it, instead of getting an actual analysis. And which doesn't really seem scientific to me. It's a workflow to facilitate this rather than just a normal workflow. Why are we having a specialized workflow for this?
I think one of the reasons is that these surgeries are permanent. Like you can't go back, and it's that too. It's very expensive. There's a lot of things that you need to do. You'll be on drugs for a very long time. There's a very like intensive care procedure, and like we do need to be sure that this is what is actually going to benefit the patient the most. And
we don't actually know the long-term effects of the treatment itself, because if you go into this and you are in a space where you're not thinking clearly, and you go into it and you go to this is what I need, this is what I need, this is what I need, and then all of a sudden you go into another place where you're just suffering in a different way. Like, are you sure this is what you're...
Well, and it's so hard to quantify that, and there's not that many people that get these surgeries done. Like there's not first of all, there's not very many people to study, and it's a lot harder to quantify. It's not like, does this drug give you more heart attacks? Like, that's very easy to study. There's a reason why we have so many studies in that area. But
it's permanent. But the other thing is that it's permanent means that they're going to have to live another 60 years with this, or 70 or 80 years. And that means that, like, there might be psychological repercussions on that, but there's also physical and chemical repercussions of that we don't know down the road. But my problem with it itself is that these people that are undergoing it are being hailed as heroes, and they're so brave. Look at these people, they're having to deal with all this, and it's just, but they're not dealing with anything different than anybody else on this planet is dealing with. I don't like to make suffering relative because we are all suffering with the same fatal malady. And that to me is to make someone who's dealing with this, a hero and praise, and then they go through it and then they're like disregarded, and the crowd goes and finds another hero to put on their shoulders, and they cast the transitioned individual to the side. To me, is a culture that isn't thinking it through very much. And I'm on the blacklist for saying that. But
I don't really see or hear much from it, to be honest. Most of what I look up and watch is documentary style or mockumentary or something like that. Like those guys that get stock footage and just write scripts and record over it. I watch a lot of stuff like that. I mean, the nonfiction I read is mostly political and economic. It just doesn't factor into anything that I study, which I find weird because every area of my study is there's a group trying to impose themselves upon it. There's a group trying to force affirmative action into schools, right? Or into police forces, or into CEO roles, or, they're doing all these things around my industries, but I haven't seen anything or heard boo about it, because it's almost like talking about genders is immediately classifying yourself as a stereotype, as a, bigot or discrimination or whatever they want to call it. It's an uncomfortable subject, and I'd hope to make it less uncomfortable so we can discuss it more appropriately.
Yeah, that's a good point, because like I'm scared of saying things that will get me in trouble. And like I feel like I have like somewhat of an understanding of how this stuff works biologically, but even
I'd say so, yeah.
Thank you. Even like saying stuff like this, like talking about Mullerian ducks and Wolfian ducks and all this stuff, there are people that would be offended by me saying that. But I mean, I can't live my whole life in fear of this, right? And I think the best thing that we could do for people is just have them understand as close to what is actually true as possible.
I think you've done a good job at that, and you too, Jordan.
Oh, we're smiling, but our faces probably aren't coming up.
Yeah, so I think that's a good place
to wrap up for a bit.
Wrap it up. I don't really have any other final comments to say, other than if you've been watching, you made it this far.
Congrats,
but definitely that this was not, again, exhaustive. There's been hours of this, but again, we glossed over it, and this is just a couple people with some interest in some study, trying to get a sense of it, just as you probably are yourself. So let us know in the comments. But before we frivolously go back into our normal lives, do you guys have any last points of gravitas for us?
Nice. I just want to thank you guys for having me on. I actually started to enjoy it at some point, so thank you guys for that.
I'm not sure if that's complimentary. That was very clever.
You're welcome.
My only point of note, I guess, would be we have an RSS feed now, so you can look us up, our podcast. The URL is driver.com/feed/rssfeed.xml. You just
Maybe
plug that
link
into
that in the
a
description.
podcast player, and it'll show us all our old episodes in MP3 as well as the new episodes. I'm posting them there before YouTube usually, just trying to give an advantage to our podcast friends because, you know, screw you, Google.
Oh, this video is getting taken down for sure.
Yeah, so
It's
thanks
okay. We
for
can
tuning in,
put
though.
it back up. Yeah. And we'll see you guys in the new year.
Next week, same bat time, same bat channel.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.